So in conversation today, we have two members of the MBS faculty. We have Geoff Martin, Professor of Business Strategy, and Glenn Hoetker, Professor of Business Strategy and MBS Foundation Chair of Sustainability in Business. We're also joined by my colleague Cameron Brooks, a Senior Consultant from Organisational Learning. Cameron will be monitoring the Q&A and chat and helping us to manage questions today. The title of today's conversation is fairly timely and potentially somewhat provocative, in that we've called it, "Don't Burn Your Future as You Fight to Survive Now." So during the conversation, we're aiming to explore a number of points. Operating and strategizing in two worlds, that's during crisis and after crisis. What can, can't, and must change after the crisis. The defining features of organizations and leaders who thrive during a crisis. And understanding how during crisis actions will enable or constrain after crisis opportunities. To get us started, Geoff, I'd like to turn to you and the title that we have for this conversation, "Don't Burn Your Future as You Fight to Survive Now." Tell us more about that title, Geoff.
Yeah, sure. No. Good morning, everyone. So the challenge here is to try and think to the next horizon as we try and fight for solvency and build liquidity in the current period. So there's a natural tendency to look inward as we try and address short-term cash pressures, build those liquidity ratios. But the risk is that as we do that, we kill the golden goose. And by that I mean, if you think of organisational health as a function of the quality of the relationships with employees, customers, shareholders, creditors, maybe a regulator, if you come out the other end of the crisis with irreparably damaged relationships, well, you'll have an irreparably damaged set of intangible resources, which will really damage your ability to thrive in that post-crisis world. There's a great quote by Henry Kissinger many years ago: "The historic challenge of leaders is to manage the crisis while building the future," and therein lies our challenge.
Thanks, Geoff. Glenn, what's your perspective on the same thing, on that title that we've created?
I think it's incredibly important. And just to sort of give a concrete way of thinking about that is the value of thinking about options in our decision-making.
Right.
And the whole idea here is that we don't have enough information to make decisions. You know, we don't know when the economy is going to open, how fully it's going to open, if people will come back to work, etc. So we have to make decisions now. But as Geoff said, we want to be sure to make them in a way that gives us opportunities to make additional decisions down the line.
So keeping options open for ourselves. So it's interesting. You raise points here where I'm hearing this with the clients I talk to as well. And there's underlying this is the desire for a level of certainty when there is no certainty available. So seeking clarity in there. So what's going to guide that? What are some of the techniques? What are some of the places to turn to help create that? Geoff, you've got views on this.
Sure. So firstly, we've got to come up with decision-making frameworks. So as we address each of those scenarios, and we're coming up with structured ways to think about those scenarios in terms of who the competitors could be, what the level of demand will be, what government regulation will look like, what our supply chain will look like. So we've got numerous scenarios to plan for. But as we think about how we will respond or plan for those scenarios, I'm thinking through what is my purpose and what are my organisational values. So when I say thinking through, I'm coming back to. So hopefully that's clear. And one of the 200 variables that are positively associated with firm performance, the most powerful predictor of organisational firm performance is strategic clarity. And that's defined by the proportion of people in your organisation who top of mind can reveal your purpose or mission. And I use purpose and mission interchangeably. So purpose tells me two things. It tells me what stakeholders are most important to you and what is your value proposition to those stakeholders. And this will differ within industry. So I can think of two hotels within an industry. One, the purpose is very clearly about the travel experience. So it's about customer and industry. And the other, it's very clearly about the employee and bringing the employee along on a wonderful life journey. So whatever your purpose is, you've got to make sure that that is pinned to the wall and is a really key part of how you make decisions about the where to place and how to win, how we're going to operate. Now, the how we operate also needs that values piece. You can have a very clear story about the value we're trying to create for specific stakeholders, but then we can go about executing that in ways that are inconsistent with community expectations or our expectations of ourselves. And so, for instance, you tell the Australian cricket team to go and win cricket matches and you don't mention and don't put sandpaper in your pocket. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create behavioural boundaries. In the for-profit world, you can think of organisations that had value propositions or purpose around convenient or low-cost provision of goods or services, and they do so in a way that is really harsh on competitors or employees. Sorry, on suppliers and employees. So they've executed on purpose, but in a way that has been really unethical. And as a result has had long-term negative financial effects for a shareholder. So what we're trying to do here is say, what's our purpose? How does that affect our decision-making? And what set of values guide our behaviours on a day-to-day basis that limit reputational risk and make sure we behave in ways that are consistent with expectations of those in our community so that we don't burn social licence. Social licence, interestingly, has come roaring back for a lot of key institutions and key businesses in recent times, which is really different to 2008, where purpose seemed to be being exhibited as shareholder returns. Whereas now we're seeing a lot of behaviours within corporate Australia and corporates globally that suggest there's a broader purpose here, taking care of employees, taking care of customers, trying to build a society that is functioning. So purpose is our guiding light, our North Star through this process. And it should be our North Star at every point in operation, but particularly important when we're cost cutting. And potentially there's a lot of dispersed decision making, which is great during this period, and it's unleashing a wave of innovation and creativity. But we've got to make sure that all of those micro decisions going on across the organisation are being made in a way that has a consistent decision-making framework. We're not pulling in different directions or behaving in ways that potentially are undermining one another. So purpose and values is one. Now I translate that at a more granular level into value proposition. So value proposition to customer or employee, and you stop and say at a very granular level, how is a decision made to engage with us or to choose us over a competitor? So that's going to have changed quite significantly in a lot of industries through this crisis. So I'm asking the question, well, how is a customer making a decision to buy your product or service? And how are you now positioned to be the most likely choice for that customer through this period? So trying to track the decision-making processes of the customer, how those customer preferences have changed, but also building that second horizon. There will be significant changes as we come out the other end of this. So we've got to try and work with scenarios now for how the customers are making decisions and retool and configure our assets and resources to thrive in this environment, but also be ready to come out the other side in a way that's capable of delivering to whatever those customer needs will be at that other point. And finally, objectives. So given our value proposition and our purpose, what set of objectives should we be setting across multiple horizons? So generally for the next 6 months, our objectives will be mostly for the majority of organisations will be about cash flow, but you need a close second and third in there, which will be the quality of the relationship with the customer reflected by NPS or whatever other measures of customer satisfaction you have, but also employee engagement. So we've got to make sure that as I said in my opening statement, we deliver on those cash flow goals, but we've also got happy customers, happy employees. How do you set objectives over 2 horizons to make sure that everyone in the organisation is aware that we have multiple objectives? We've got a priority, it's financial risk in horizon 1. Now that priority in horizon 2 may move from financial risk to getting the offerings right or customer satisfaction. So have objectives and objectives across multiple horizons. Now, objective one will probably be something like build and survive. Horizon two might be strengthen. Horizon three might be thrive. So think about that multi-horizon objective approach.
Yeah. Glenn, building on what Geoff just said there, I recall a story that you told us about something that happened during the GFC. And it was an American organization that you know about. Can you go back into that and tell the story again?
Absolutely. And this ties into that idea that you want to avoid making final decisions as long as you can. You have to make decisions. They may be big decisions,
yeah.
But if you make them in a way that lets you make larger decisions when we have more information, then you're in a stronger position. And so the company that we were talking about is called Barry Weinmuller. It's a manufacturing technology company in the central US.
Uh-huh.
And when the great financial crisis hit, they just had a catastrophic decline in their orders. And there was no way they were going to be able to keep all 12,000 employees on the payroll. And this is a company that had always defined itself in terms of how it treated its employees. So they could have made a really final decision and just said, sorry, this is it. We have to lay you off to survive. But you might not get those people back. You'll never get the culture back. That's a very final decision. Instead, they chose to do that cost cutting in ways like cutting discretionary spending, cutting retirement contributions. The CEO cut his pay by 90%. And they asked everyone to take 4 weeks unpaid leave at a time of their choosing. They could have made that same savings by laying people off. They delayed that. Now, if the recession had dragged on, they might have had to start laying people off. But they postponed that painful decision. As a result, when the economy started to pick back up, they hadn't had to reach that laying people off stage. As a result, 2010 was their best year ever. And they just went from growth to growth.
Yeah.
Could I offer another example? And it's one that's very conscious to all of us, and that's here at Melbourne Business School. Like most universities, we're moving to entirely digital delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were thinking about how to invest in doing that, there are two extremes we could have gone to. We could have said, you know what, the future is digital. We're just going to make a huge investment, build up our capacity now, and we're just set for the future. We could have said, you know what, this is a one-time crisis. Let's make the investment we need to serve our students really well digitally, and that's it. The problem is we don't know what the role of digital learning is going to be in the future. We have ideas, but this is a once in a lifetime full nation experiment, right? So what we've done is we've chosen to invest more than the minimum, but less than the maximum, so that once we get clarity about in the after crisis stage, how important is digital going to be, we can continue to build, or we can step back. And this has worked really well. It has had concrete implications. More people have been involved. It's been a more cross-functional team that's been involved, but we've done it by thinking in terms of options. So the idea that I think you should take away from both of those is this: we have to make decisions. They may be very painful decisions, but if we can make them in smaller increments, and if we can make every decision in terms of at least thinking about how does this enable me to make further decisions down the line, we're better off. And that could relate to how we cut expenditures in that Barry Weinmuller example, or it might actually mean making a slightly larger investment than you might otherwise, with an eye towards options. And that's the MBS example.
Great, thank you, Glenn. I've been thinking, as you've been talking about that, about the decisions and how those decisions are guided for the organizations we work with. I created a poll, which I think would be interesting to take a look at for the audience, for you to take part in, and think about what's happening for you. Can we launch the poll?
I've launched that, so people should see that on their screen now. So if people could just populate that with their answers. I'm going to give you another 10 seconds to vote. For anyone who hasn't had a chance to vote yet, do so now. All right, and I'm going to close the polling. I'm going to close the polling there.
Great, thanks, Cameron. So, Glenn, Geoff, what do you make of that?
Shall I share that on screen?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah, interesting. And with that purpose one, I just really like to ask the question when I walk into a room and I've got a group of executives or a group that report to the C-suite. And I reckon usually it's less than 10% can recite the purpose off the top of their head. And that's generally a problem. So it's great to see there's 63% yes there. And so our values, purpose, and guiding response to the crisis. So that's fantastic. And what I hope is happening there is the CEO is articulating that, and they keep coming back to purpose or values when they explain significant decisions or processes that have been kicked off during this period. So that's really good. I come back to, I guess, two big questions here that, from a strategic perspective, that we've got to answer, and how I want purpose and values to come to the fore, but also how I want our clients to be and students to be revisiting strategy during this period. And that's through two lenses: the where to play and how to win. So two tightly related questions. So the where to play, so what markets will I compete in? And this is where we're getting very creative right now. So usually when we look for growth options with a client, we start with the safe story about market penetration. So how can I do better in my core market? The next question is, how could I sell existing products to new customers? So this might be new segments within my existing geography, or it might be going to new geographic segments. And the other one is selling new products to existing customers. So both of those have an element of safety, as in I've got the relationship with the customer, or I understand the technology or processes associated with that service or product. But what we're seeing a lot of now is new products to new customers, which falls into this broad category of diversification. So when we look at new products to new customers, so there's risk there, but we're seeing a lot of risks being taken at the moment, but in really sensible ways. And we call this retooling. We stop and say, from a where to play perspective, given the resources and capabilities I have or could build rapidly, what markets should I participate in? So the where to play decision, we look at three questions as we go through this. So one is the inherent attractiveness of that market through a five forces and pestle lens. So there we've got to do the scenario analysis and say, what do the five forces look like today? How will that change in 6 months, 2 years, 5 years? Now the second part is capabilities. So it might be inherently attractive, but I just don't have what it takes to win in that market. Or maybe I do. And maybe I need to think creatively about how I could rapidly build the capabilities necessary to differentiate in that market. The third piece is just the economics, which is a combination of 1 and 2, of inherent attractiveness and capabilities. I'm forecasting revenues, and I'm trying to work out what it will cost me in terms of variable and fixed costs in order to win in that market. So here we're doing cash flow analysis, we're doing net present values, we're looking at balance sheets, we're trying to pull all that financial piece together to try and work out whether I can win in that market. So this is the where to play analysis. So when you think of those pieces, so the inherent attractiveness, my capabilities, and the economics, all three of those are likely to have changed fairly substantially in any industry in the last 2 months, and probably will change significantly again in 6 months. So we need to have that strategist hat on right now and just kick the tires and say, right, what's my corporate strategy right now? Defined as, here's my where to plays, and here's where I don't play. And make sure you write that where I don't play down. And the where I don't play, that's where you get creative and say, right, so what markets am I not in that I could be in? And I've actually made choices, possibly subconsciously in the past, to not play there. How can I revisit that or refresh that piece of analysis so that I can say to important stakeholders, the board, investors, look, we've made a decision not to go there for these reasons, or we've made decisions to go there because we back ourselves and they're consistent with purpose and values. Now, the other piece is that the how to win. So how to win is a story about how I differentiate given a set of difficult to imitate resources and capabilities. So everywhere to play, so every market you've chosen, you need to have that story. You say, I'm differentiating in that market using this value proposition, or I aspire to differentiate in this way. And I think I can get there. I'm not going to be perceived as differentiated when I first go into that market, but I will. I've got a plan as to how to differentiate in the long run. So I've got that. And I explained that I'm going to be able to differentiate because I have these tough to imitate resources, culture, some kind of brand, go-to-market capability, some kind of ability around managing talent or processes. So I've got that combination. I've got my where to play, and it's supported by strong stories about how I'm going to win in each of those markets. And the markets I'm not playing in, equally, I've done that analysis and said, I'm choosing not to play there because I don't have what it takes, or it's in an unattractive market.
Thanks, Geoff. It's so we've got where to play, how to win, building the capability, and we've considered options. Glenn, what would you add to this?
I'd add the importance of cooperation, really now more than ever. And you know, as Geoff said, this is a time where it's really natural to look inwards, right? We're under high stress as managers. We're trying to take care of our own employees, and add to that social distancing and working from home, and a lot of that informal collaboration and communication that used to happen just isn't anymore. And that's sensible, and it's okay to a degree. But a lot of the success we're seeing is in companies that have found ways to cooperate in new ways with existing partners and maybe even seek out new partners. And this is important because of what I talked about for options, and it's important because it gives you better information. So let me just give you one example. It's a company called HEB. It's a very large grocery chain in the state of Texas, and they have a global supply chain. And back in January, they started to hear rumors of this strange virus in China. They immediately started reaching out to their suppliers and even retailers in China, then in Italy, then in Spain, to say, how fast is this progressing? How is it changing how people shop? Getting to, how did it affect your supply chain? How do you serve communities that are under lockdown? And they also put relationships in place to ensure that the supply chain would stay as stable as possible. That actually all led to their doing a tabletop planning exercise that they had set up after a hurricane in 2009. And they had that information. In terms of options, they had a real challenge. As happened in Australia, but even more so, you had people engaging in panic buying. And so they, to keep their shelf stock, needed to dramatically increase their delivery capabilities. But they didn't want to invest in a permanent expansion of that capacity because this was going to clear up over time. So they started to work with a food distributor called Labatt, which generally serves institutional customers, hotels, schools, folks who weren't in business anymore. So Labatt's trucks, Labatt's drivers were sitting idle. The company was in danger. And instead, they got together, and now Labatt drivers and trucks are distributing material to the HEB stores that the trucks are well equipped to do. And they've actually done the same thing, perhaps the first time beer distributors have been shipping eggs in their trucks. So what they've done is they've been able to deliver superior service to their customers. They're keeping the shelves stocked. They've done it without making a permanent investment that would lose value later on. And they've supported other companies in the community and generated goodwill in that way. Now, how will that Labatt relationship continue into the future, the relationship with the beer distributors? We don't know, but they've got options they wouldn't have otherwise. Those partners are around. The goodwill with customers is still there. So they've accomplished good things together. They've set that stage for future collaboration. And it's been risk sharing and looking for complementarities. And extending that logic, they've done something good and useful in the during crisis world while thinking about options in that after crisis world. And that's exactly the kind of collaboration and decision making we'd want to see managers making.
Yeah. And I was just going through my mind how interesting it is. It takes a crisis to push us out of our comfort zone, our familiarity, or the familiar ways of doing things. I'm just wondering how many people listening today are finding that themselves or their organizations in that space where they've gone to new thinking. They've started to say, this is possible. And what wasn't possible 2 or 3 months ago suddenly is becoming possible or is becoming thinkable now because of what we've been forced into. I think a question at this stage would be, what do you feel, and I think this is a nice way of capturing a lot of the conversation, what do you feel are the defining features of organizations and leaders who thrive through a crisis? Len, can I come to you first?
Yeah. So I think as background, we have to be honest, these are incredibly tough times. There's no sugarcoating it. There's tremendous damage being done throughout the economy. We just simply have to get through it. It's overwhelming, and it does call for decisive action, but I think the most effective managers are the ones who don't limit being decisive to making big, bold, sweeping decisions or heroically going it alone, right? The ones who expand that thinking about what is being decisive in a smart way. Well, it goes to Geoff's point, values, purposes. It goes to making decisions in a way now that sets you up to make more decisions or have more freedom in your decision making later. And it's fighting that tendency to look inwards and communicating and cooperating with your current partners and with new partners so you can make more informed decisions and, again, preserve those options for the future. So I think that's what characterizes the decision making that we want to see from the really effective managers now.
Yeah, thank you. And Geoff, again, what are the defining features of organizations and leaders who thrive? What's your perspective?
Well, I think the qualities of great leaders won't change. It's just the implications of poor leadership will be magnified during this period. But I think there's this really nice combination, and that's really critical right now, of the top down in terms of purpose and values, but allowing the bottom up, as in I'm going to allow this organization to share this responsibility of finding new revenue streams, finding ways to cut costs, finding ways to make sensible decisions that are consistent with purpose and values. So understanding what's got to come from the top and what needs to come from the organization. And then you've got this piece around transparency, just making sure that the CEO is completely transparent about the situation we're in, so we can share the problem, share the objective. But also, I think what is a really critical defining feature right now is an ability to repurpose and re-energize through a crisis. So because we're going to reveal our purpose, and our purpose will be pinned to the wall more so and guiding these decisions, because there's more decisions going on throughout the organisation on a regular basis. The fact that purpose is revealed and it's put front of mind more so than it had been in the past, that can be re-energizing. And so I'm energizing this workforce with this vision of the future I want to see. In 5 years, this is what this organisation is going to look like in terms of outcomes for stakeholders, outcomes delivered within this organisation. You want to be a part of that. Let's get on board. Now that requires this priority in the first 6 months, which is financial survival. But then we're going to get onto this story in terms of these amazing services and products that we're going to deliver to customers. And you want to be a part of that journey. And this is going to work for these reasons. So they're offering hope about the future, but giving a story about the priority. So the priority now, but there's a priority now, which is important because of this future that I want to see that might be 5 or 10 years away.
So it's holding those that long view, short view, and being clear about what's important. I'm hearing in the conversations that I have, and that I know that Cameron has, and others, my other colleagues have, this idea of building trust, of empowerment, of dispersed decision making. As long as it's guided by that common understanding of purpose and values, is becoming so important. So I'm just checking the time, where it's 8:32. What I'd like to do is shift over to questions and answers, and start with a question that came in before this event. This came from, hopefully Kit's with us today, but this came from Kit. A question: how do you balance a focus on retention and profitability versus investing in growth channels as things begin to pick up? I'll just repeat that. How do you balance a focus on retention and profitability versus investing in growth channels as things begin to pick up? Who'd like to take a go at an answer on that?
So investing in growth channels. So I guess this is a very common scenario for most organizations. And we talk about an engine too. So where is the new wave of revenue and growth going to come from, say 2, 3, 4, 5 years out? So here it requires an assessment of the extent to which the current platform is burning. So am I on a platform, is my core market declining at single digit or double digit per year? In which case there needs to be relatively rapid deployment. I need to be testing and learning and experimenting. So I think, so my message is we need to be testing and learning in the new market and trying to work out, to use Glenn's language before, how to do this in a relatively low financial commitment way, particularly right now. So how to test and learn in that market to try and work out whether it's something I need to rapidly redeploy resources in. So in summary, it's a function of the extent to which the current platform is burning, and a function of the costs of testing and learning, although I've got to try and do that, but also of the attractiveness of this new market. So in the current world, because digital and online is just rapidly increasing, we're rapidly redeploying resources, just to give you an example. And so we're not going to kill the golden goose. We've got a golden goose, which is our cash cow, but we're going to rapidly try and make this new market work.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. Glenn?
I'd build on that. I'd reinforce that idea about options, small decisions, so you can learn, that set up futures. But I think it also takes some discipline to think about what you won't do, what you will step out of. And that requires thinking about, as best we can tell, how after crisis is going to look relative to during crisis. And this is tough because we're finding ourselves having to conduct those little tests in the during crisis world. And an example that comes to mind is this barrier that has fallen between markets around some types of medical equipment. You have clothing companies making personal protective equipment. You also have F1 racing teams making ventilators. And you can think about that from the viewpoint, and they're doing this for humanitarian and social benefit reasons, which is fantastic. Now, what does that mean for those companies going into the future? I really doubt high-end designer lines in fashion are going to continue to make face masks. So, minimal investment to serve that great need, then get out. On the other hand, there's some really specialized learning that's been happening in the F1 teams. And I don't expect to see Lotus continuing to do ventilators per se, but some part of that business, some part of that learning might very well continue into the future because they've created a distinct capability. So some of it is just as you reach out and go into different industries, different segments, thinking about, is this really a during crisis? I mean, if we're honest, we're doing this to get out, or are we learning something that might have useful legs afterwards, and balancing your investments accordingly. Of course, the flip side is if you're a medical equipment maker and you suddenly have F1 teams playing in your field, should that worry you going forward? You know, if I make medical gowns, I'm just not that worried about the high-end fashion folks staying in my field. So I think it's being willing to recognize that certain things just aren't going to make sense in the long term and step away from them, conserve those investments.
Yeah.
So you can make small testing investments that would set you up for being able to make bigger decisions once we've got more information.
Yeah. So as you've been saying, it's about having options, but making decisions on those options.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. So Cameron, you've been monitoring the Q&A in the chat. Any questions coming through that you've noticed a particular interest in?
Yeah, I might start with one from Dave, which has picked up a number of votes, which is relating to, he said, do you think purpose and values have actually fundamentally changed, or have organisations simply honed their narrative more creatively, i.e. is this just been?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so really good question. So the question I ask whenever I see a purpose on a website or something that's articulated in the press, I'm always trying to work out, is that actually lived, and is that driving decision making within? So the skeptic in you will always say, is this a marketing exercise? And have you just carried on doing things the way you always have? And the way to test that within the organisation is to just try and work out how often the CEO or the leadership team explain decisions through the lens of purpose and values. And sometimes I've seen some really effective CEOs have very, very obvious values that they never put words to, but in their weekly call with their employees, if I asked you to sit in on it 2 or 3 times, it'd be very obvious. If I said to you, what are the 3 values of that CEO? You'd probably rattle them off. So the question is, are they lived? Are they real? Is it a marketing exercise? Is it an exercise in trying to convince an important stakeholder that we should have a social license to operate, when in fact we don't deserve one?
The piece I would add to that is, what are the firms actually doing? And so I see that I've seen this in some research I have going on, and I see it very clearly when I teach. There's a narrative around sustainability, that this is important. And then when you ask people, are there sustainability metrics included in your annual review? And very often the answer is, well, no. Are there training opportunities made available around this? No. Okay, so if you're having to decide, do I pick the more sustainability-oriented supplier or the cheap supplier? Which one do you think you should do, even though sustainability is part of your company's mission? And if you look at what actually happens, the incentives, the decisions, the investments made by the firm, that's really going to shape whether you believe that statement is lived. And there's that really complementary role. It has to be conveyed by the CEO, but it also has to be lived by the company. And that no amount of narrative improvement is going to convince people of something if they don't see it backed up by concrete investment and decision making.
Thank you.
And a really good litmus test there as to whether it's lived and real is how far through the organisation is it understood.
Mm-hmm.
So Disney, right? So it's a safety, courtesy, show. So that's 3 values at the theme park. So a 16-year-old is empowered to tell a 7-foot NBA player that their crying daughter can't get on because they're a centimetre lower than the bar, because we put safety before courtesy and show. That is values lived at the extreme. On another client in the power industry, so safe, reliable, affordable energy. So they go all the way to the apprentices and say, right, you show up in an outage or you're onboarding a new apprentice. How will that be guided by the mission of safe, reliable, affordable energy for your grandmother? So we want to put it in front of everyone and say, given that set of values, how will you deal with this scenario? Interestingly, I do a bit of work with some sporting clubs, and some of the high performance sporting teams are really ahead of the game in this, where they're saying to athletes, right, so you're in this situation in a pub, or you're in this situation on the field, given that set of values, how will you respond?
Cameron, I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question if we can do. What else have you noticed?
So this one's talking about somebody who works at Australia Post have said that they've experienced an 80% increase in parcel volumes in recent weeks, and the business is now struggling to manage that sort of level of demand. And they're just interested to know, and others have been interested as well, is how would you turn this sort of time into developing a disadvantage into a long-term advantage? Is this a great time for a business transformation for maybe underperforming parts of your business?
Yeah, and I would say absolutely. So in terms of stopping and saying, so transformations are driven by a long-term objective of who we want to be and what we want to reveal or what we want to deliver to important shareholders. So now is a great time to stop and do that. So there's a lot of debate right now as to should I get on with the short-term firefighting and leave this strategy stuff till later? Absolutely not. Because we could go on fighting fires in ways that irreparably damage that future and make a transformation not possible. So if we're going to do a transformation, we've got to say, what's that future that we want to see? And how does my behaviour and activity in the short term, in Horizon 1, enable or constrain my ability to deliver on that future, which is the outcome or intended outcome of a transformation?
Now, I suppose I'd add to that, it's a fantastic time to understand where are the stress points. Systems are really under stress now, and that's going to help reveal where did we fall short. You know, what can sort of silently fall off the table in normal times that's now become really evident. It's a great time to think about the vision of where we want to go. It's probably the right time to start thinking, making investments, getting commitment and buy-in, even if you can't operationalize this yet. This is not the time to rip out conveyor belts and put in more efficient conveyor belts if you're drowning in parcel delivery. So that execution, maybe there's a little bit we need to wait. Maybe there are things we can do right now. But just because we may have to wait before we do a massive physical reworking of our processes, for example, doesn't mean we can't be making really important steps towards that while, and this is critical to Geoff's point, while we get on with handling the current abnormal situation.
Thank you. Thank you both. What I'd like to do is just share my screen so that we can just bring today's conversation to a conclusion. So I'd like to thank Geoff, Glenn, Cameron, and in the background, Joe, Danielle, and Tom today. And thank you all for joining us. If you've enjoyed the session and would like to suggest topics for further discussions, we welcome your feedback. It's very valuable to us. So please complete the brief survey link. A link will come to you shortly. And there's also another point I'd like to make, which is there are further events happening. The first of those is 2 p.m. tomorrow, when we're talking about when home becomes the workplace. There's also going to be the next in the Talking Business During Crisis series. I will be speaking to Dane Glasgow, who leads product management at Google Maps. There will be a webinar addressing the findings of research into financial decision-making for retirement. And then at the next Talking Data speaker series, Glenda Crisp, the Chief Data Officer at the National Australia Bank, will be joining. So 4 events there. Please feel free to sign up to them. You can see the email, the events at MBS if you have any requests, if you have any questions of today's panelists. Take a look at the website mbs.edu events for anything that's coming up. And thank you. Enjoy your day. Join us again as we have more conversations in future. Stay safe.